In the den of iniquity, vicinity no pretty, calamity fi hit we any moment, what's a pity. Tomorrow never certain, what dwells behind the curtain, the face of evil lurking with the shifty eyes averting. It's not a steady bubble that either pop or topple, many will fall and stumble, let the dozers gather rubble. From LA to Colorado, Guinea to Burkina Faso, cannons will breach the towers and the troops will storm the castle. I say, run, run, come, make we get it, because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. So run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. I say, run, run, come, make we get it, because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. Lord, run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. With the rubble steady rising, and hearts are compromising, convictions here are stifling, making evil appetizing. The fists are steady forming, and countenance is falling. Defenses are withdrawing, possibilities are falling. In these your circumstances, evil will make advances. Pick up your sword and lances, and be sure to take your chances. Victory is never promised, the battle is upon us. Gather the brave and honest, and the righteous in your corners.
Good evening, good evening, good evening. Welcome to another episode of Getting Itch Done with Ike and Dr. Thunder. Get that finger of yours and click that like button, okay? Click the like button, share the stream as well. How's it going, Dr. Thunder?
I'm doing all right, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing well as well, and we're going to be talking about doing well today on this episode of Getting Itch Done. And we're going to take a slight detour here to talk about culture, right? The culture of getting things done. Is there such a thing as culture affecting your ability to in general, shall we say, acquire wealth to be successful? Is there a culture curse and or a culture blessing? Is this how do we explain certain disparities that we see? Right? We know the typical topic, and there is this video from Glenn Lowry, okay, that I would like to share with you, sir. And it's one of his previous, one of his early conversations with. His name escapes me now. The guy on the right,
Yeah.
Coleman Hughes. One of his previous conversations with Coleman Hughes, and here they're talking again about the culture thing, the culture question. But before we get into it, Dr. Thunder, why is the culture question such a thorny one? Why is it politically incorrect to talk about culture? Or why is it sometimes maybe seen as maybe uncouth or maybe even ignorant of understanding of? First of all, do you see this thing that I perceive in terms of it being politically incorrect to talk about culture? Say, hey, the culture of this people, the culture of that people, that kind of a thing. And especially when it comes to explaining the differences in outcomes.
Yeah, it's an artifact of multiculturalism. So multiculturalism, part of multiculturalism is that you're supposed to only talk about other cultures in the positive sense. And all aspects of culture is good and positive, and who are we to judge what is superior about certain cultures from other cultures, right? This is an artifact of multiculturalism. Now, and I've talked about this at some length. One of the problems with multiculturalism is you have a sort of group of elites that are actually hand selecting which aspects of these cultures that are all being represented, which aspects will be put forward and be celebrated. So at best, all you end up getting is a sort of whitewashed version of whatever the culture is. But then at the same time, you're not permitted to be objective in analyze positive aspects of culture, speak as though they are superior to other aspects of other culture, and then vice versa, talk about negative aspects of culture, dysfunction in certain communities, and associate that for why they are not as successful as other cultures. So yeah, so that's sort of why I think that it's like a taboo to talk about culture.
Okay,
You know?
so you asked the question, or I asked the question about the taboo, and you answered it quite well. You say it's because of multiculturalism. However, I would say that you haven't got quite to the root, right? In terms of, you're saying, oh, multiculturalism caused it, and maybe I don't understand what multiculturalism is what I'm saying. I'm not saying you haven't gotten to the root, but you say multiculturalism caused it, and I'm like, well, what is this? Who brought in multiculturalism, and what is its purpose? Not to go down on this complete tangent here, but
well, a purpose of multiculturalism, I think, initially was to try to bring a lot of things together, somewhat in a sort of university kind of context. University meaning unity and diversity, right? So you bring all of these things under the same umbrella, and then it fosters conversations and the ability to actually benefit from other cultures. But what ended up happening in actual practice is people basically shied away from, again, this sort of superiority of certain cultures and inferiority of other cultures, not wholesale, but even in an itemized sort of fashion.
Good point there. So the impetus for multiculturalism was to maybe reap some of the benefits of this smorgasbord or whatever they call it here. I'm gonna go to this buffet, take certain good aspects of certain things in the whole kind of university mode.
Right.
Let me state one point there while we're there, especially with the university. I think that multiculturalism is generally a political impulse, which is part of let's try not to kill each other, right? That's the huge part of politics, especially especially in the globalized world. You're right. We can't have all these European states killing each other over religion and this and that and who has the best duck confit or whatever, right? We can't be fighting over culture like this, and we cannot be very. So let's try to quail all that heat, right? By talking about cosmopolitanism and finding, generally speaking, universal things that tie us together. And this is, in other words, trying to get away from the killing is not a bad move, right, Dr. Thunder? So far, would you agree?
Yeah, no, I think anything that you can do to, because I think in general, people are very much the same despite what their cultures are. We have kind of basic needs, basic desires, and they're pretty standard and uniform.
So you agree with a certain sense of generalization or finding generalities, finding commonalities, if you're finding foundational things to tie us together and all that kind of stuff. Here's the part where why I brought up I started talking about this in the university context is because I think that this particular political project got infused into academia. In other words, that the entirety of academia, so or philosophy, let's just call it philosophy, got wedded with political ends too deeply, right? Because the whole realm of inquiry, this university that's supposed to be happening, this unity in diversity or one movement that's supposed to be happening, right? One turning and all this kind of stuff. This is not about peace. It is about inquiry, right? If you get what I'm saying, right? So you take a political goal, which is peace, which is, hey, let's be relativistic, let's be multicultural, live and let live, who am I to judge, right? That type of stuff. And you bring it into the lab, okay? You bring it into a biology lab, it doesn't work. It's like, what do you mean peace and who am I to judge? I'm here to judge and learn and discern and argue and so on. So I think, by the way, that my general thesis is they became this kind of it's almost like the academics, because they couldn't get power directly or something. You may see where I'm going here, but there's this lust to get into political ends, and it destroys what the university is supposed to be about, ends up undermining their whole project, because you can't have these two things going on, having political ends in a place where it's supposed to be about inquiry. I don't know if you have any comments on that, and then we'll get into them.
Yeah, so academia is interesting. So I've talked about what I call the academic bubble, and the academic bubble is basically the longer you're in the sort of academic bubble, the less actually engaged with, aware of, participating in the real world you actually are. So, and in particular, one aspect of the academic bubble, one critical sort of component, one of the things that causes this sort of what I call the academic bubble is tenure. So, because when you become tenured, then in many disciplines in the university, that seals in. No longer is it necessary for you to truly interact with the actual job market, with the actual, with the real world. In music, I talk about this in the actual music industry, not the one that existed 30 years ago when you entered the bubble, but rather the current bubble. So it makes it that it's very common for advice from academics not to be particularly relevant to the actual market, the market that's happening right now, because they've not had to interact with that market. I can't remember where I was going now, because now I got stuck in the academic bubble. So
yeah, you got stuck in your own academic bubble, sir.
Yeah.
But yeah, I went on my
screen. But what were you? But what were you asking? Because I was going to tie
I went
that
on my
together.
Screen, it might come back to you. I went on my screen about how basically academia is taking on certain political ends, and it's not a it happened in 1980 or something, and that's why I said philosophy. In other words, the whole turn of thought took a turn with certain, and then go ahead.
Yeah. So that's so the way to acquire power. I mean, because you're not necessarily engaged with the actual market is through politics. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's going to be the only way that you actually can do that. And politics is basically the same. Some of the details and the nuance change, but it's basically, politics is basically the same. So that it gives you an avenue. And in that way, actually academia, especially with this sort of social re-engineering aspect of, certain left-leaning politics, academia has actually led the charge and tends to be about 10 years ahead of a lot of the, with the new innovation of social culture is going to be, it's about 10 years before. So in that way, it's not sort of curatorial, which academia tends to be curatorial. It's a heavy component of what it is. Not going to tend to tell you about it's not like Google Maps. It doesn't know where the construction is, and it can't tell you how to get off on this highway early so you can avoid such and such a traffic. No, that's not what it does. It's not in the now like that. But with respect to the political aspects of it, it tends to actually be ahead. So I think that's an interesting reality or whatever. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, so we're talking about culture. Okay, we're talking about culture and we're talking about wealth, and we're about to play this video. And then I mentioned, why is culture a sticking point? This is where we went with it. We talked about multiculturalism. We said, hey, culture is a sticking point because there's a political, general modernity, modern political impulses about kind of moving a little bit of the culture out away from how we connect with each other, how we relate with each other, what our statehood, nationhood, whatever it is. Moving more towards a one world, we are the children, cosmopolitan type stuff. Fluffy on its face, maybe a little sappy and disgusting. Well, as I mentioned, you have to give the devil its due. It's better than killing each other, right? However, there are certain bad mixes that happen when you then take the realm of inquiry and you turn it into sophistry, right? I mean, as a matter of fact, this is what sophistry is what you guys are doing over there in the universities. Isn't it right, Dr. Thunder? But anyways, let's go ahead and start this.
Because I was very struck by a particular piece of yours from over a year ago, or almost a year ago, in Black American Culture and the Racial Wealth Gap, in which you take on this consensus argument about first of all, the fact of a disparity of wealth between Blacks and whites, and secondly, of the extent to which that disparity is a congealed reflection of a history of racial oppression, and that, sort of equal justice for African Americans can only be achieved by, in some way or another, addressing that disparity. And you want to examine the sources of that disparity. You don't dispute the fact that it exists. And that takes you into the realm of talking about African American culture, and more generally of talking about how it is that we want to parse this question of, given the mistreatment and discrimination in the past of African Americans, what responses are appropriate in the present day. That's right on up to the issue of reparations, which has become a topic of debate. So perhaps we could begin, if I may, by asking you to summarize a bit the structure of the argument that you offer in that essay, Black American Culture and the Racial Wealth Gap. I mean, I might just add culture. You know, you're taking on this big kind of elephant in the room bugaboo, culture. You're daring to talk in explicit terms about racial differences in culture and the consequences thereof. So I just invite you to take a minute or two to describe what you're after in that essay, and we can take it from there.
So I split the essay into 3 parts. The first part was giving a summary of what I view as the progressive consensus on what is the cause of the racial wealth gap, which is far larger than the income gap between Blacks and whites. And I identified 2 main factors in the progressive narrative, the first being slavery, and the second being a suite of racist New Deal policies, or New Deal policies that whites benefited from that Blacks didn't. Foremost among which would be the FHA loans, government-backed loans that went almost exclusively to whites, that made it easier to get access to homes that then appreciated in value in the 40s and 50s. So in the first part of the essay, I just challenged both assumptions. The first being slavery as a main cause of wealth in America. This is as a matter of.
I want to ask you something, Dr. Thunder, because after all, we're talking about wealth and we're talking about wealth creation. I don't know how much thought you have given. You are our resident Black nationalist on the show. So I don't know how much thought you're giving to the idea of slavery being a source of wealth in America, right? A major source of wealth, and the political ways in which that idea is used, right? To say, hey, you know the ways in which it is used. And does that argument have any pull with you, any traction with you, that, hey, without slavery, you would not be this, or somehow there's a kind of a reparation.
Slavery was definitely necessary for those big plantations and agriculture and just different ways that we sort of got beyond a certain hump as a country. Slavery was definitely critical to that end.
Okay, let me ask. You said necessary, and then you said critical. Shall we pick one? Because you could have had wage labor. Big agro business could have like low, even cheap labor from across the border or something. So was it necessary, or it's just a historical factor?
Yeah, well, maybe it wasn't necessary the way that it happened. I think it was more efficient. Maybe that's a way to put it. If you have to pay, then you can't get as much out. You can't produce as much. You can't do as much as quickly. So possibly I would argue that. But that's not the more interesting question or topic associated with slavery. What's more interesting to me is what happened after slavery. And if slavery was the sort of profound death knell to any sort of success for the Black community, then how come the Black family structure, 85% marriage rate, low, out of wedlock birth rate, Black Wall Street, there's a lot of things that, even though things were so-called separate but equal, and segregation was the law of the land, and Jim Crow and all of that, it seemed as though as a community we were able to still, maybe because we had a common foe and we were forced to do things together, we were able to create a pretty healthy society, healthy culture, right? But then once we start to sort of take more of these kind of handouts from the government, it becomes this sort of poisonous, this poison that pollutes our whole culture, and it's as though we can't get away from it.
Let me ask you something here, and I like that you brought in culture right there. Because we're talking about culture. You say, hey, after slavery, the culture was still intact. The culture was still such that you could say, hey, this is good for acquisition. You mentioned Black Wall Street, for example, right? And then you said something about maybe the fact that was all working out was because of, kind of a false imprisonment, Stockholm syndrome. We have to work together type stuff. We have to deal with the boogeyman. We understand how we are motivated as human beings when we have an external common enemy, right? And then you say there's the welfare that comes along, and when you start taking that stuff, it'll ruin you. And that's the part where I'm like, okay, cool. It can't just be the welfare. Perhaps what you said earlier about that false imprisonment, blah, 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 right? So maybe the welfare part just represented like the unlocking of certain, the gates, if you will. Like the door is now open for you to leave. You don't have to be with Mr. anymore, color purple style, right? You can now leave. You can get yours. You can be a strong, independent woman. Don't need no man, right?
That's
Point
right.
being, saying all that tongue in cheek. Point
College
being,
educated.
Because college educated. Because one can say, hey, how about does welfare equally destroy? I know that certain people like to argue politically that any kind of handout is bad for the soul, generally speaking. But I wonder in terms of groups now, right?
Okay, so
is it the case that it destroys groups?
Yeah. So let's back up a little bit. So I would argue that what did the most damage to the Black community was forced integration. Right? Now, you have the government sanctioned terror against our financial institutions. So Black Wall Street, actually sanctioned by the government, was actually destroyed. And there were dozens of Black Wall Street and systematically destroyed by our government. Right. So that's not a boogeyman. That's actually something the government specifically did against our interests because we were doing too well. Okay. You have the government participating in incentivizing our women to choose government daddy over the biological father. And that had a profound impact on our community. And I would argue that in my interview with BGS Ibmore, that was several months ago, one thing we talked about and that he mentioned is that the slaves were taken from all kinds of different places in Africa. There's a lot of Western Africa, but there were hundreds, thousands of tribes that the individual slaves were taken from, right? And so the only thing that they had in common was slavery. That was the thing that actually bound the slaves together. That was the one cause. That was their function. That was their purpose, right? Now, when you take slavery away, you can't really expect folks that came from all of these different places to just work together, because they didn't come from the same places. They didn't have the same cultures, okay, where they were taken from. So that's one thing. Unless segregation forced them to do so. All right. So segregation actually created more of a singular goal of a cultural purpose and a cultural sort of identity, right? So then when you eliminate that through forced integration and not done in an equal fashion, right? Because equal integration would be you take white folks from their communities and you bust them into Black communities too. You know, you got the white kids going to the black schools and the black kids going to the white, right? See, that would be equal, but that's not what they did. They said, okay, black folks, you're going to get spread out. And by spreading us out, I think what happened was our lack of, you know, we weren't all taken from the same place. So we no longer had this sort of thing forcing us to stay together, segregation, right? And so a lot of the dysfunction that I think you see in the black community is because we're not, you know, historically, genetically, culturally, X, Y, and Z, we're not all from the same place. Okay. And we don't have this common purpose. You know, so I think that's a big problem with that. That's an explanation for why things are the way that they are. Now, I don't think we can use a lot of this stuff as an excuse anymore. I think we have to say, okay, maybe this is what got us here, but now we need to do something about it.
So
okay,
let me ask you right there on that point. But you know what?
And that actually could be the strength, a strength of multiculturalism, is to a people that is so spread out, for us to be able to look and say, hey, what are some positive aspects of other cultures? But that's not what happens.
Shout out to the super chat. We'll address, well, thank you very much for the $2. Daria, I believe. And we will address the question about money being owed and such things. Well, Dr. Thunder, you're talking about culture and how perhaps a culture went wrong. Describe a culture when it was still intact. Talk about certain factors that are necessary perhaps to keep that culture intact, and how these things were dissolved by forced integration. Okay, and it makes sense. One can look at, I mean, there are many analogies one can think of. You know, you need that togetherness, and a lot of times that togetherness is as a result of external factors. In other words, let me not overcomplicate it. I think that the point is clear. But then, or let me not move further. Let me ask you, because the point now is how much, how powerful is culture, right? Because if it is the culture that you have said, oh, it's gone bad, you can't just now stop and say, oh, I'm going to do something about it, right? Because culture seems to me to be something that you can't just say something like that about, right? So if you get my drift here, but let's. I'm completely derailing the conversation, but it's okay. But they're going to get into that, obviously, right? But the whole point is, how much traction does culture have? How deep is it? You know, and
I think it is. I mean, I think it is a powerful force, but mostly powerful in the negative sense. If you don't engage in any sort of critical thought associated with it, I think most people don't really think about it critically, and so you're caught up in something that you don't really understand, and you just sort of repeat things that you're seeing, and you're not evaluating, is this make sense? Should I be doing this, or should I be doing that? Or why did my parents make that decision? Or why do I see my cousin over here doing this? Or, you know, so I think if we are critical about aspects of culture, it gives us the potential, the ability to maybe not repeat certain mistakes, and maybe not be controlled by the sort of invisible guide that we can't even see it, but it's sort of boxing you in and stuff, and you're just walking where you can, and you're not even thinking, is there another way that I could go? You just go the way everyone else is walking, you know? Yeah. Okay. Before we play the video, shout out to Darius. Darius talking about someone owing her money and what to do about it, and maybe hypothetical, maybe real, but after all, this is about getting ish done.
for me, and I answered in the chat, I said lawyer up. And for things like this, because they asked for a recommendation, for things like this, all you need is to get like a monthly subscription legal shield, right? Let's say, right? At some tier where the basic level tier, right? And you can call a law firm to send a legal letter. Now, rule number one about making these kinds of moves when someone owes you money. Well, number one, there's nothing wrong with it because a deal's a deal, business is business, blah, blah, blah. It should have never gotten to this point to begin with, right? It should have never gotten to this point. But if they have money, if they have the money, then it is worth it to go forward with this legal letter, threats, put some teeth behind it, something like that. Because let's say it goes to small claims court or whatever it may be, there is some mechanism for trying to get the money out of them. But if they don't have the money, right, then it's all a waste of time. Then you cut your losses, then you learn and you move on, right? There's no point in trying to force. There's no debtor's prison. You're not gonna, if people don't have the money to pay you back, there's nothing you can actually do about it, which is kind of like an unfortunate thing. But just wanted to
Now I'm going to answer this in a different way because say if the question is actually so if we're talking about reparations, so in this case the government knows they owe us money. However, the government won't pay the money. What would they do to not have to pay the money? They never ever really be called to task to pay the money back. If we take it to mean that might be a more interesting and actually a question related to what it is we're talking about. What do you think? How would you answer that question if that was the question? If it's not rhetorical, because that it could be rhetorical in which it's sort of.
How would you answer it, Dr. Thunder?
Yeah. So if the question is rhetorical, what they're saying is the government doesn't have to pay back because they're not going to be compelled to pay back. They'll do other things so that they can point at those things and say, hey, but we're taking care of you this way. Or, hey, we gave you the first black vice president, or we gave you the first black president. Hey, they'll do stuff like that so that, hey, the first black, female Supreme Court justice, hey, the symbolism thing, right? So you use symbolism and then you don't ever have to actually do anything that actually dramatically improves, the financial, political, status of the black community. You don't actually have to do anything for that. You just select a few folks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, that's as good an answer as any, to this hypothetical question. But yes, we're going to continue here, and Mr. Coleman Hughes has laid out the typical case. He's calling it the typical case from the left, if you will, about slavery, Jim Crow, redlining. Right? Did I get it in order? I think so. Okay. So that kind of move and the shall we say forced integration, which are some nuances that someone like Dr. Thunder would add, causing the destruction of the family and all that kind of stuff. Would like to interrogate that point though about exactly the welfare thing, because people mention the welfare thing, but I find the welfare thing is almost like the welfare just catches stray bullets. It's like welfare is like I didn't really have much to do with this. I was just here. I was just kind of in the room. It's like there were all kinds of reasons why this thing is falling apart. Why is everyone pointing to me? It's my suspicion. Purely.
Well, it's in particular, it's policies that were imposed more ardently against in the black community when the black women would choose government daddy. They had policies saying, well, if we're gonna tighten you up, then the father can't be present. The father can't be living here, he can't be present. So they say, well, we don't need you. We don't need him.
In the black community, like how did they target this stuff in the black community? I'm sure all kinds of people and also immigrant groups want some of this cash everybody's trying to get money from the government, right? So how?
Yeah.
come?
So this is I mean, now they pay closer attention to what the government's doing and the way that the social workers, the kind of questions that they're asking based on the race of the person they're asking the questions to, right? They're paying closer attention to this now. And so I don't think that there's the same sort of level of kind of clear black and white kind of stuff. However, it was a matter of the way that the stuff was enforced, as opposed to there being a specific policy, right?
Mhm.
So the social worker, can say, okay, well, this is black, they black here, so we're going to be real specific about imposing this aspect of the policy. Where you go to a white community and you don't necessarily be as, you're not necessarily imposing it as with a sort of level-handed kind of thing. So that's what's being claimed, and I think that I think it's true. And even if the case was they were applying that equally in black and white communities, I would still say it's still going to have the same, impact in both communities. And since in our community there's more out of wedlock birth rate, there's a higher out of wedlock birth rate, then you're going to have a worse
Snowball.
you're going to have a worse outcome.
100%. So, and Daria, by the way, no, the question was actually quite good, and it is related to the topic. Okay, and we have the Kwafi Nuno in the or Nano, whatever, never Nino, Kwafi Nino. This is also related to the topic. The culture of Pookie and Ray Ray and whatnot, and what that has to do with anything. But let's continue with Mr. Coleman Hughes here.
Economic history, I think, is, it's obviously a very complicated story, but I don't buy the narrative that slavery is the main driver of wealth historically for virtually any of the major enslaving nations. If you look at, for example, how is Portugal doing today? It's like maybe the 30th wealthiest nation, and they imported the most slaves of any country into the New World. So and then countries like Singapore, which were themselves colonized, are now wealthier per capita than the countries that colonized them, like Britain in that case. So I think there is kind of a lazy assumption that slavery, it's kind of based on this deeper fallacy that if one nation is wealthier than another, they must have plundered it from someone, which there's this assumption sometimes called the lump fallacy that wealth is just there to begin with. And the question is how we divide it up. But in reality, wealth is created and continually created. So I was questioning that assumption about slavery, first off. Second off, I was questioning the causal story about how big a role redlining played in the creation of the wealth gap. Not questioning that it played any role. Clearly, the ability to get in, to make a down payment on a house easily in 1940 meant something as housing values rapidly appreciated. I don't doubt that made a difference. I doubt, however, the extent to which that made a difference. What I argued against is there's this way in which people tell a post hoc story about explaining a disparity that we see today with the unstated assumption that the primary driver of wealth creation in multi-ethnic societies is government favoritism from the top down. That's one element, but if you look historically throughout the world and even in America, that hasn't been the most important causal factor. So you could look at the Japanese in America who, there were laws on the books from 1913 to 1952 preventing them from owning land or property. And yet by 1960, the Japanese have a higher rate of college attainment than not only Black Americans, but white Americans, right? You could look at the Jews. There's no reading of American history in which America has been disproportionately kind to the Jews relative to, say, Protestants. And yet there was a study from 2003 I cite that found something like a 7-to-1 household wealth gap between Jews and conservative Protestants. So nothing has been more normal in America or throughout the world than for a despised minority with no political power to nevertheless have more wealth than the majority. And the second point I'll make there is that if we're going to tell this post hoc story about how a wealth gap was created just by government favoritism. That also should lead us to consistently to tell a different story about why blacks are so dominant in the music industry or the NBA, for example. The story would have to be logically that the music industry was way less racist than other
Because you're getting exploited, Dr. Thunder.
places, other sectors of society, which I don't think is actually true. I think black people simply would not be denied in the music industry because the human capital in that narrow band was so obvious to people, black and white. So that's like the first third of the essay.
Let me stop you there. Okay, well, if you have something else you want to say, go ahead.
No, that's all.
No, I just want to keep this in a manageable set of segments so that everybody who's listening can stay in touch with the full contours of your interesting argument. And, I like to try to summarize when my guests present, as you just did, an extended statement, how I understand what it is that you're saying. So we're starting now with a critique. We have the wealth gap, and you're not disputing, you cited a 10-to-1 figure. We could go into some discussion about whether and how you measure and what that means. These are the ratios of the median black and white household. Okay, so you've got a survey, you've assessed the wealth of each household, you look at a distribution, the median is the 50th percentile, the typical half less wealth, half more wealth person, and then you take the ratio of those medians. I could give you a very long critique about why that's the wrong way of trying to measure the disparity of wealth, but I won't bore you with that. That's where we start.
Well, I heard someone say that the mean would be better, but I'm not sure that I agree with that. Maybe
you got distributions. Why not look at the whole distribution? You've reduced it down to statistic. The median is one. The mean would be another, but you've got the whole distribution, so I can tell you what percentage of people have wealth above or below any particular.
I was about to say what Glenn just said right here, but let's not go nerd out on why people look at one number of it's like it's almost like, okay, you have this trash heap, okay, it forms this heap, right, or whatever, and then you just kind of pick this corner, or you kind of say you just pick a general color that you see over here, like, oh, blue. I want to characterize this trash heap as blue, and that's why the whole thing with stats. Someone else can come around and look at it, say, oh, it looks green for me, and well, at sunset it looks red, and anyways, Glenn is gonna come for him here about the whole slavery thing, which I think was an unnecessary thing. In other words, trying to debunk the value of slavery to a nation's economy, I think it's not necessary. It's like it's not a necessary battle for him to be fighting to say, hey, slavery was not that great. It's like, dude, if we're talking about culture, talking about current gaps and stuff like that, I get that slavery is part of the argument that some people give, but I think that even for the most lefty person, at some, slavery, just the whole slavery thing gets weaker and weaker every year, right? You got to tie it to some other thing. In other words, the chain becomes more tenuous, or the connection becomes more tenuous when you keep on saying that systemic disparities between groups is due to slavery, right? So having to argue, oh, slavery didn't help that much, I think was a non sequitur. I don't know what you think about that point, that whole him talking about Portugal and this and that and Singapore.
Yeah, I thought this was some interesting points that he was making, and I think it is a healthy practice to call into question the magnitude of the wealth creation associated with slavery, because it's such a convenient sort of argument to pose. And as soon as you pull that one out, you say, hey, but slavery, then it's like everybody's supposed to, the obligatory response is just to basically clam up and, okay, I guess the argument is over. But I think it takes a certain kind of kind of inquisitive and nature to ask that question with some sort of what kind of clarity. So with some kind of clarity or whatever. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, I'd need to take a closer look at the actual statistics associated with each one of the locations that he mentioned, to see if that's something that I could totally get on board with. But I've never really thought of slavery as being some sort of I don't like the argument that gets presented that if if you are wealthy, if a country is wealthy, or a particular family is wealthy, that necessarily they got it from dabbling in slavery, from some sort of atrocity against humanity.
Oh, you don't like envy? Is that
Oh,
what you?
right. That, there's a sort of, some dirty bastards and in the family line that actually, stole the patents from, some unsuspecting black people that should have actually got the money. I don't think it's always that. I think there is a history of some of that, and there has been a lot of theft with respect to music in particular.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of that theft has been facilitated by, and we're talking about culture, an aspect of black culture that I think tends to be too trusting and not litigious enough, not doesn't do enough to protect intellectual property.
That's a good point there, because it gets back again to this whole thing of, because the culture aspect of things can be like things you can do from the inside, right? So you just mentioned one of the things that you could do from the inside. Like maybe your attitude towards business is not such that it's maybe you're not litigious enough, you're not protective enough, you're not cutthroat enough, whatever it may be, right? Maybe you need to be more like the small hat people in whichever particular way one could say, right? So even outside, in other words, after you wade through, was it slavery or was it not slavery? Was it this and that? Was the impact of slavery in the wealth, blah, blah, blah. After you wade through all that, you still have to then come and look as an individual, number one, but also as a group. If it's true of an individual, it can be true, it also be true of a group, and say, hey, what are the ways in which, to your point, we can borrow some of the good skills the Joneses have over there, right? I want what the Joneses want. They seem to be a good guy. He just does that thing. I want to know that thing. How do I learn that thing? But to your point about slavery, though, my intuition is this. It's not a question of people pulling out data and narratives to say, hey, how about Singapore? They were slaves and now they flipped. Or somebody say, no. It's I can clearly show you this one family or this how they used the slaves to build the railways and now that kind of stuff. The point is, there's too much chaos, entropy, and overturning of things, right, in history for anybody to know who is right. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
it's like,
right.
because you can it's just become all kind of smoke. You can draw through lines through anywhere to make whatever argument you want to make. And at some point, you're just like, why you guys? It seems a little too history, economy, and also you mentioned about wealth creation and especially technological innovations and the ways in which things move forward. It's too complicated to try to be drawing these through lines, right? Anyways.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with my wife earlier today, and one thing, we were talking about. Often it seems to me that black folks, we tend to be playing checkers, while other cultures, let's say white folks, and let's talk about the elite white folks in particular, because I think that the average and the poor white folks, they playing the same checkers that black folks are playing, right? But other folks are playing chess, and we seem to only be as aware of or be playing what the next move is going to be, whereas other folks, they're playing the long game, and they're thinking 6-7 plays down the road, and there's no way that by playing a different game than the others are playing that you're going to be able to get the same kind of results.
Yeah, you know what? That gives you it's a perfect analogy there. That so this is now moving to Africa now, and a certain type of checkers mentality, where somebody was arguing in some African panel about how the Chinese should give us nukes the way they helped out with the nukes in Pakistan because blah 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 blah, and literally there's someone thinking, hoping, wishing, give me nukes. They go right. They say, and it's it's like, why the hell would anybody do that for you or whatever? What kind of mentality is that? what kind of, have you been asleep the past few centuries? Don't you know how power works and how the world works? You're just gonna think that things should just, now it's your turn, or it's gonna be a good, they should use you as a pawn to balance power, with the West, right? Give you some, anyways, it's the same kind of stupid, and I'm the one using these words right now, like stupid, right? Not you, I'm not saddling you with that. But same kind of stupid mentality where you're playing chess rather than checkers, as you put it. You don't think strategically enough, and they don't think crudely, and I mean that crudely. They're always on this kind of weird communitarian bent, right? And I don't understand why. But anyways, let's continue a little bit here. I think Professor Glenn Lowry is about to get into the whole kind of the slavery thing and why it may be hard to argue.
Level of wealth, and that's where the discussion should start. But these are quibbles.
Okay.
I mean, the main point is that because I think that numbers like 10 to 1, 30 to 1, 51 give a wrong impression. This is all I'm saying, of some kind of, anyway, I don't want to go into it because it's a secondary point. Your main point is about what are the sources of wealth. And the moral argument about the people who are making a big deal about racial wealth disparities, like Ta-Nehisi Coates, like my former graduate school colleague, the distinguished economist Sandy Darity, and his colleagues are making in their work about the wealth disparity, is you see their history cast a long shadow. You see there the dispossession of people, the plunder of Black bodies, Black wealth. Slavery is important here because it's an expropriation of labor. The labor of the slave is not allowed to accrue to the benefit of the slave and her descendants. It's rather expropriated the value, the surplus value by the slave owner. This dispossession, no 40 acres and a mule, no land holdings, et cetera, is the root of the disparity of wealth, and therefore the disparity of wealth occasions the need for some kind of intervention like reparations, which would be a redistribution of wealth in order to rectify this historical dispossession. This is the argument, and your critique, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just trying to summarize this, I won't go on very long, is no, the source of wealth is not just something that sits there. You call it the lump fallacy. I think that's an interesting phrase. It's not just something that sits there. This is a very dynamic system. And the counterfactual argument, had there been no slavery, there would be a very different distribution of wealth, you think, is refuted by observing for countries that were slaveholders, for areas of the US that were slave intensive, they're not necessarily more prosperous, and that for areas that were exploited or groups of people who themselves have been exploited, and we could add to your list. You've got the Igbo in Nigeria who suffered the exclusion. You've got the Chinese throughout Southeast Asia who, et cetera. And this is all straight out of Thomas Sowell. I can see you've read and you are acquainted with your Thomas Sowell, because Tom Sowell, I will say the great Thomas Sowell, has been making this point for a very long time about discrimination doesn't imply or necessarily correlate in a one-to-one way with differences of wealth holdings or income or occupational status or whatever, because there's all these variations. And ultimately, this does come down to culture, which is everything that you want to talk about. But I just want to say a couple of things as pushback, okay, on your argument. The fact that Singapore is richer than Britain or Holland, and that Portugal is a relatively middling, almost a poor country, doesn't establish that the 17th century, 16th, 17th, 18th century wealth accumulation, a certain elite population in Europe that was a consequence of the slave trade wasn't real. That those two things are not necessarily the same thing for the very reasons that you offer. There's an evolutionary dynamic that's going on. So Singapore is a nation city-state of largely Chinese, entrepreneurial, dynamic, aspiring and acquisitive and accumulative population. Yeah, they're richer than Portugal, but that doesn't mean that, or England or whatever, but that doesn't mean that the economic history of the 16th, 17th, 18th century and the evolution of global disparities isn't fundamentally influenced by the structure of relations and property ownership and industrial dynamic that flew out of slavery. I mean, it's like the connection between the thing that you're measuring, likewise the states, that the thing that you're measuring and the causal claim that you want to make is very tenuous. The connection between those things is tenuous, just like the states. Of course, Mississippi is poorer than Massachusetts. I grant you that. Mississippi was a slave state and Massachusetts was not. Therefore what? Therefore slavery doesn't make you rich? No, come on, that's not a serious argument with respect. Massachusetts or New England, more generally, New York, Connecticut, there were insurance companies, there were banks, there were all kinds of interconnections of economic relations, such that the fact of slavery and the cotton trade, the triangle trade, Atlantic system and whatnot, created the opportunity for surplus and for economic growth that well may have left a pattern of distribution that benefited the Northeast more than it benefited the planters.
Well, doesn't that imply, so most of the important patents that were made in America were made in the North, not the South?
Yeah.
Doesn't it imply that the thing creating more, the human capital that was creating more value, that was coincident with slavery, was more coming from the North rather than the South.
I think that's
and
true.
it could be the case that all of the industrial factors, like that should be separate from the phenomenon of forced labor itself. You could have had industry with wage labor. So the question is isolating the variable of forced labor rather than wage labor. How much did that account as a main driver for the wealth of America? I don't think it was main. That's the point I was trying to make. But I can see that.
Well, let me just finish making my point. My point was that regional variation today in the wealth of the Northeast and the South doesn't prove the claim that the institution of slavery had no contribution to the accumulation of wealth, because it's an integrated economic system. And the specialized activities of the Northeast, such as you were just describing, like investment in innovation and human capital, may have been more valuable because of the fact that they were connected in an integrated system to an economy which was also partly driven by slave labor. You did not have to be an owner of slaves or participating in the agricultural sector of the economy in order to benefit from the fact of slaves or the existence of the agricultural sector of the economy. That would be a little bit like people arguing today that because Harvard University and Yale University sit in the Northeast, and because all they do is grow soybeans in Ohio or Iowa, therefore the contribution to the US economy, or making these silly, what I think are silly calculations, like they say, look at who pays into the federal government and look at who gets benefit from the federal government. Therefore, the states who are a net deficit in that they pay in more than they get are carrying the states that are a net, they take out more than they get. It's a system. It's an entire system. Let them stop growing the things that they're growing in the Midwest and see what happens to the US economy. Eventually, it will affect the value of a degree from the Harvard Business School, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think.
So ultimately, yeah, Glenn came in and cleaned out the house with regards to the whole logic of the situation. You can't be drawing through lines through these amorphous long. There's a billion data points, and everybody can. It's like it's kind of silly. Hey, look over here. Hey, look over there. Hey, look over there. But they haven't.
I will say this, and unless he clears this up, unless he redirects to the specific point that was made, because in his response, he has not addressed the specific issue of the difference between forced labor versus wage labor. Mm-hmm. And so I do want to hear him talk to that point, because I do think that is an interesting nuance, and in central to the point that Coleman is making. It's central to the point that he's making. He's not saying that it was not a factor, that slavery was not a factor. His question is, how much of a factor would it have been? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's a big difference.
And I had asked you, did I not ask you in this conversation about you could have gotten a whole bunch of people and paid them wages, right? And then you said, more efficient. I didn't quite ask you that question, but we clarified between the necessary, critical, more efficient, but perhaps not necessary, and perhaps you could find other efficient ways, of bringing in people and doing that.
Well, I mean, I think today, perhaps the technology exists that would perhaps be more efficient than enslaving people to do the tasks that the slaves were doing. So stuff like picking cotton, there's probably a machine now that does that at a lower cost than it takes to feed slaves.
Yep. This is true. And I think Glenn just really wanted to clear up the point of these, he just came in to play the mathematician here a little bit, because I think it's kind of obvious to the intuition when people start doing this thing. It is obvious to your intuition, like that. Come on, bro. What it's like you're trying to anyone could come in here and make arguments about this stuff. And at the end of the day, we don't even know. We cannot quantify, right? Over something we cannot know and quantify. And if we were to know and quantify, then what? You know what I mean? It's like, then what? Where is forced labor, gives you 35% more efficiency. Oh, okay, now what? What am I supposed to do with that? Did I put money in my bank account? But anyways, let's continue.
I think that's right. I think if I can make that argument again, I don't think I would make it with the North versus South comparison.
Ooh,
what I'm arguing against is the idea that America's wealth was created mainly on the back of slave labor, i.e. the counterfactual that but for slavery, America might be just another middling country on earth. That doesn't make any sense to me. the Aztecs had slavery, but very little wealth. Slavery has been ubiquitous in civilizations for the past 10,000 years. So what is the variable that changed in the 1700s and 1800s? Clearly, it had much more to do with knowledge and skills and technology than it did to do with the phenomenon of forced labor. So I was taking issue with the Ta-Nehisi Coates line that the economy of this country was built on the back of slaves. And therefore, we all kind of are benefiting unwittingly from what was the main cause of American wealth, namely slavery.
I happen to agree with what you're saying. I'm glad you had a chance to clarify it. I happen to agree with what you're saying, the Coates and company, and it's not just him, vastly overstate the importance of plunder. And it won't just be limited to slavery. After all, the lands were appropriated from the native populations. They stole the land from the native population. The culture is built on plunder, it's built on slavery, it's built on the genocide, et cetera. They stole the land from the Mexicans. They stole the Southwest from they, of course. They are we. I mean, let's not even get into that. Let's not get into who the national subject of these discussions are and how it is that Americans, all of us, benefiting from the structures of a social organization, political development, economic enrichment in which we are situated, nevertheless divide ourselves up into these groups. And so the blacks are supposed to be, we identify now with the slaves. We sit here in the early 21st century rich. I digress, but you'll allow it, I'm sure. Rich by any measure. We're amongst the richest people of African descent ever to exist. We are so privileged. We have so much opportunity. There's so many things that are possible for us. We're rich. And yet we identify as second cousins of the Native Americans who were exterminated by the plundering, et cetera, and merely and only the descendants of slaves whose ancestors were dispossessed and so on and so on. So I have much sympathy with that critique that you're offering. And I just will add, and I know I'm going on a little bit, just give me another minute. I'll add, causally, as a causal matter, you're exactly right. The question is, had I not had forced labor, had I had contract labor or wage labor, would the patterns that we're looking at be significantly different? To which I think we have every reason to answer no. So working class immigrants, Irish in the northeastern seaboard from Boston down to Baltimore in 1840, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, wage laborers.
So he has given an answer?
Yeah, he has given an answer. So he basically agrees with, although he disagreed with nuance, and he helped Coleman to actually create a better argument. He actually improved his argument, but then concluded the same way that
as usual. Yeah, as usual. And by the way, if you know,
so heavy, man.
Yeah, and there is a mode that he gets into, and this was a particular one when he's kind of irritated with the logic of something, and that's what he had to do there. Like, he can't blah 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 blah. And I kind of knew that he doesn't necessarily mean he's arguing the opposite, right? Yeah. But he's just saying, hey, look, anyways. So he has given you an answer. Let's see.
We're looking at be significantly different. To which I think we have every reason to answer no. So working class immigrants, Irish in the northeastern seaboard from Boston down to Baltimore in 1840, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, wage laborers, working at barely above subsistence, exploited by any left-wing Marxist or socialist ideology. These were exploited working classes. Wealth was accumulated on their back. How much of American wealth is due to the exploitation of wage labor from 1850 to 1900 versus how much of it is due to the expropriation of slave labor from 1850 to 1900? I dare William Garrity to make that calculation. I dare you. It's a head count. I'm just talking. Let's look at the profits of companies that were engaged in the textile industry or in the.
That'd be a good study, a good Sunday read. A good scientific paper, like breaking it down. This is the Irish. This is how much they would have paid. This is the profits that were gained from these particular factories versus the Do we want to get into that?
Whatever, like manufacturing or whatever in the United.
But I'll tell you, the thing is, if someone would really conduct that survey, that study of those numbers, even if they show that clearly there was not this sort of massive benefit, this overstated benefit from slavery, and that they can show that actually there was more egregious infractions against people that actually were receiving a paycheck. I think I think people would still hold on to the old argument. They would
Dr.
still
Thunder, but of course. I mean, come on. I mean, you just say, hey, some result of some experiment is going to come out, and people are going to change or people are not going to change their minds. Like, well, yeah, of course, people are not going to change their minds, but also here is one way to kind of just neatly package what's going on here. There's some people agitating about numbers, like, hey, I benefited or this particular travesty, that was heaped upon my ancestors, benefited the country so greatly, and we were not able to participate from the largesse, from the benefits, from the fruits, if you will, of my ancestors' labor, right? And I can calculate it for you, okay? And people are going back and forth about the calculation and all that. And the point is, it's not about that. They're trying. People are making a moral argument about slavery and about the fact that you owe them something, right? You owe me $100, Dr. Thunder. I don't care whether that $100 enabled you now to be able. Why am I getting into that with you, right? I'm going to add interest to it, and I'm going to ask you to pay me, right? So I'm moving through phases here, which is just recognizing that argument is pointless. Even if somebody won it, okay, no one would win it, okay? Then there's a moral argument to be made, which also is pointless, because moral, what? Rational is not going to work. Neither is moral, okay? It's only power, right?
Yep,
and there are ways of forcing people to do things without necessarily shooting them or whatever. So what I'm saying is, it's got to be power of the sort that it's either economic or it's political of a certain kind, where you're boycotting this or whatever, or it's organized of a certain kind. By that I mean political, right? Organized, and you're trying to do something, trying to affect some change in the world to make these people do, to make China give you nukes, or to make your own nukes, rather than to argue with China about why they should give you nukes, which is basically what the people are doing whom are counting beans on either side. It's like, no one is going to be convinced with this. Am I right, Dr. Thunder? Haven't we seen that?
Yeah.
Obviously, this argument has no end, even the moral one, which one could say, okay, that is the one that is devoid of, you don't have to count beans, right? Either you enslave me or you're not. It's not a utilitarian argument, let's say. It's a moral argument, but that one we know also it's not going to convince people. Well,
yeah.
Let's
yeah. I think it's interesting too, this the moral business, because I think that people would agree that there's a different morality in wartime that's acceptable from in times of peace, right? I think people they can see that. So if you're a soldier and you're running in the field, you have your gun, and it's the enemy. Yeah, you're not supposed to murder. You're not supposed to kill. But also, you're at war, and so it's either kill or be killed.
Mm-hmm.
And there's certain other dynamics, right? You're not supposed to steal, but you are trying to take their land.
Yeah, not to mention the general who sends wave after wave of soldiers knowing they're going to die, but it's for a delay. And it's not like they're a bad general. They actually, the general that knows these guys. But in war, so what's the moral? This is a different moral game for that general versus the soldier, right? The soldier, right. The general sending people to their deaths, right? Anyways, go ahead.
That's right. And so when you start to consider, it starts to get, it gets a little dicey, a little tricky, because when you say, okay, when you're playing the political game, if you're considering it to be war, my people have been disenfranchised. I need to do whatever necessary to acquire what I believe belongs to us. And it's political battle, it's political war, but it's war nonetheless. And you're still playing the sort of peacetime morality when the other people are playing wartime politics.
And there was never any peace. And that's the thing about it, is like,
Right.
You have never known any peace. You've always had a boot, on top of your neck.
That's
And
right.
so, wait, what peacetime? It's like,
Yeah, exactly. So that's a losing. You're never going to win that, and just because you have more ardently, and religiously followed the moral code, there is no reward, because you're playing the wrong game.
a time for
Playing
everything,
the
right? A
wrong
time to
game.
be born. There is, I believe it does say a time to kill too, right in there.
Yeah.
Uh,
A time for war, a time for peace. I mean, look, you have to know what time it is, and then you need to. What does the Bible say? Be sober, be vigilant. What does the Bible say? Um, about being wise as a serpent, and harmless as a dove. You got to know what is going on. And though I think in general we should be trusting, when I say trusting, I'm saying to try to believe in the goodness of other people, but you have to know who it is that you can trust, and you can't just extend. It's just, I mean, it's such.
Yeah, and by the way, everyone should, by the way, divide their trust into at least 3 categories. You need to stop just using the word trust, right? Generally speaking, because you're not going to be able to operate well in the world, right? You need to trust people in 3 categories: sobriety, competence, and intentions, right? You can trust your mom's intentions, but you don't trust her competence in something, right? So that it just is what it is. You could trust someone's competence and sobriety, but you don't necessarily trust their intentions. But you work with them and just watch them, right? Like, I'm not sure about your intentions, but you're a sober guy, got a good head on your shoulders, and you're competent, right? So again, sobriety meaning judgment. They got 10 toes on the ground, good, rational, able to act in real time, right? So that's one thing. You could trust that thing, but they could be incompetent too, or not know their intention. So these are these 3 things. So some people want it to be all like, I want to trust their intentions and their surprise, or they lean more into the intentions part, which by the way tends to be the least important when it comes to doing things. Okay, it's like, why do you really care what exactly my intentions are, Dr. Thunder? Like, it's like, oh, I want to know if he debriefed. Does he really? It's like, it doesn't really matter, right? But people heavily lean on that. I don't know if you have any comment on that part when it comes to the trusting that you were saying. Is that I find that people lean heavily on this, I have to trust intentions crap, when you should just be looking at more, okay, are they trustworthy, steady, sober? Are they competent? Can I get what I want type of stuff? In other words, like chess, as you were saying.
Yeah, no, totally. Totally. And I like that. That's real clean and clear, those 3 categories of trust. I like that.
Technological chaos in the building with the $20 super chat. Thank you very much. A sponsor of the show, an officer and a gentleman, or whatever. Right? Is that stolen valor? But thank you very much. Could you mind reading what he says?
Sure. I would argue the American slave labor system was naturally formed from owners trying to create enough capital to form private central banks rather than one national central bank, which aggravated the U.S. Civil War.
Owners? You mean the slave owners? Is that what the owners in the first sentence means, or the first part of the sentence? American slave labor system, right?
Yeah. Formed from owners trying to, yeah.
Create enough capital, right, to kind of rival the deal, and then, okay, it goes back to the whole, it's always the banks, it's always the money. And by the way, that is true. By the way, whatever your money, it's always the money, because And it's not like there's anything special about dollars or there's some kind of a whole, the money and the banks. And no, it's just that's the means of exchange of human value. And if you can tap into that, you can just get all kinds. It's like, it's where the juice is, right? And fortunately or not, money is a technology that we cannot do without. And somebody mentioned earlier what culture is, by the way, and mentioned that it's a gathering of technologies, artifacts, and means and methods, if you will, of being and living that people kind of gather around together. But I think we've acknowledged that it is deeper than that. That culture is itself kind of it's itself like a technology that people use. Like people are out there using their culture. It's not just something in the background. It's not a nice painting in their house. It's not what they eat for lunch, right? It's not pho. I have pho for lunch. It's like no. Somehow it's informing my day-to-day choices and how I live my life, how I view myself, and therefore the things I'm able to achieve. But let's go.
How much of it is due to the expropriation of slave labor from 1850 to 1900? I dare William Darity to make that calculation. I dare you. It's a head count. I'm just talking. Let's look at the profits of companies that were engaged in the textile industry or in the in light manufacturing or in the United States, which was the China of its era from the late 19th until the early part of the 20th century. Let's just look at what the exploitation, quote unquote, of wage labor contributed to the American economic dynamic. And let's just compare it quantitatively based on the value of the goods produced and so forth to any reasonable estimate of the contribution of slave labor to the overall accumulation of wealth in the United States. At best, those are going to be very close numbers. And my guess is the exploitation of low-wage labor will dwarf the contribution of slave labor if you made a quantitative calculation of it. So I'm trying to agree with you about that.
I take it.
Oh, okay. So you said something about the New Deal, and I want to ask you about this. Do you know who Ira Katznelson is?
Yes, when affirmative action was white.
Yes, Ira Katznelson, a professor at your university at Columbia of politics. He's at Columbia, and that is the book, When Affirmative Action Was White. I'll just say briefly. He says there was a New Deal, the New Deal because it had under the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s to get through Congress. And because in those years, the Democratic Party disproportionately consisted of representatives from solidly Democratic Southern racist constituencies in the old Confederacy, who were committee chairs and whatnot. The only kind of New Deal policy, what we're talking about here is Social Security, we're talking about aid to farmers, we're talking about aid to dependent families, we're talking about unemployment insurance, we're talking about wage and hours legislation, a minimum wage and so forth. The only way that you could get these bills through Congress was to accede to some of the racist requirements of these committee chairs to tailor the New Deal so as to not upset the hierarchy of racial domination that was characteristic of the South before the Second World War. And as a result, the welfare state that emerges in the US as it comes into the 20th century without really a social economy, mainly a laissez-faire economy, but comes out of the Depression and the New Deal comes and all these institutions are created, which are a $1 trillion level hit in terms of the magnitude of the impact that they're having on the structure of the US economy. Blacks are left out. Maids and domestic workers and farm workers are not covered by the unemployment insurance and the minimum wage and hours legislation and whatnot. Administration of the farm aid policies and the welfare policies are left in the hand of local officials who are not subject to any kind of federal requirements or strictures that would ensure that they administered their programs in a racially equal way. And as a result, the net benefit of the welfare state was vastly disproportionately tilted toward whites and away from blacks. The New Deal leads to the GI Bill as a way of dealing with kind of a compensation to and acknowledgement of the service of people in the generation that fight World War II. But the armed forces were discriminatory in their rules about who could serve. And as a consequence, the eligible population for GI benefits. And so, you see how it's going to go. I don't have to go where Ta-Nehisi Coates goes to, redlining of housing markets and whatnot, although we could go there. I'm saying this is a big, large, huge, transnational, transeconomic, transgenerational, structural phenomenon. And it is, to some degree, racially biased. Do you deny that or the significance of that for contemporary inequality?
I deny only the outsized significance that's been attributed to it by progressive scholars. The question of A, yes, that happened. B, the counterfactual where that didn't happen almost certainly involves Black people having more wealth today. I don't see how it couldn't. The question is, if you're looking at the total wealth gap and you're trying to attribute on a percentage basis what factors historically drove it, I don't know where that would fall, but the way people talk about the relationship between historical racism and the wealth gap implies that those kinds of policies account for 90% or more of the racial wealth gap, which I don't buy. Again, because just I don't want to sound like a broken record, but how much did it matter to the Japanese to have laws preventing them from owning property?
I think that the point that he's making here is a key one, because, in saying, okay, look, there are a number of factors, but you guys are over harping on this one factor, and I don't think it's that significant. There are other factors to look at. Some people may push back at it and say, that's like saying all lives matter. You get it, right, Dr. Thunder? It's like, what do you mean? I'm talking about this. How are you talking about all of that? But here's the thing about contexts such as this. There are already factors that keep people poor, or that will, in other words, not everyone is going to rise to wealth from any particular group. And there's certain other kinds of factors that will always have cause a disparity between groups, even if you remove all the prejudices or whatever, you develop the human potential, all those kinds of things. And there's just certain things that are unknown. That is also a chunk of why things are happening with regards to the disparities, in this case, of wealth, right? So people always forget that in this basket of factors, there's also a nice 30%, which none of us understand and can't control. So any part at all that we can talk about with intelligence and control, even if it's 10% that he is talking about, right? He comes in and says, hey, I have this 10% thing here I think we can work on. It's very important to work on it, because you don't know about the rest of it. The whole point is we can't be sitting around here arguing about this goddamn bag, some of which we'll never understand, and let's work on what we can work on. What do you think about that, Dr. Thunder?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I like it in general when systematically, resolutely, clearly, logically, excuses that people use frequently are dismantled and shown for how they are not the real reason why they haven't been successful. I applaud, celebrate. I like that. So this is a good line of argumentation. Yeah.
There you go. And again, ladies and gentlemen, before I continue, please click that like button. You got to do that. That's important. Okay. If you like the conversation, go ahead and share it. Share it with your friends. We're over here talking about getting ish done. And we're talking about the culture of wealth. Is culture associated with your ability to acquire wealth? Can it stop you? What can we say about a particular culture, African American that is, and which Dr. Thunder has given us a good synopsis of how certain things were fractured, right? Forced integration was not a good thing. Breakdown of the family structure, welfare comes in and is able to exploit that. All that kind of stuff, leading to a culture which is, not causing people to get that money, let's say, right? And you admit that culture is important, that you think it is a good factor there. So, ladies and gentlemen, like Mr. Technological Chaos is doing for the second time, okay,
the big $50
to you, okay? Yes. He says, the central banking issuer. Oh, do you want to read it, Dr. Thunder?
Sure. The central banking issue, the formation of colonies post 1776, had factions, Federalists, non-Jeffersonians, whom were split over one bank settles transactions of society versus multiple banks, which conflicts with government tax power and debt issuance authority.
Indeed. And they used to have different notes back then, and this is the point I was making, okay, central bank, versus you, Dr. Thunder, you have Thunder dollars, right? You control the Midwest, right? Somehow you were able to control the Midwest. You had the game sewn up. You had a nice plantation, Candyland, whatever. You developed enough capital, and now we have Thunder dollars, that type of deal. Okay. The Creature from Jackal Island is a good book, by the way. It doesn't necessarily touch upon this time period, but it talks about the creation of the central bank for people who want to get into that rabbit hole in a rational way, as opposed to clicking on conspiracy theory videos on YouTube, right? But Thank you very much for elucidating that point, Mr. Technological Chaos, and thank you very much for the $50 super chat. So let us continue here a little bit more with this conversation, because we're trying to fight our way just to get down to the culture question, right? If you notice, we still haven't gotten to it. Everyone is like, hey, no, but it's this. How about racism? How about redlining? How about Jim Crow? How about this other thing? How about, can we compare forced labor versus unforced labor, the this, the that, blah, 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 reparations? It's like, okay, cool. When are we going to get to the inward aspect and say something about the culture? And let's give it a few minutes. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
In land for 40 years. I don't know. I'm not, I can't quantify that. I'm sure somebody, I'm not even sure somebody has. I'm not sure people are even interested in that question, because it just so happens that for reasons having to do probably with culture and human capital, the Japanese have been, quote unquote, outperforming whites on typical measures of success since the 1960s. So it's looking at, people are only interested to begin reasoning in that way when we have disparities on the ground today, which suggests that it's not.
How dare you bring up the model minority?
People aren't reasoning in a totally disinterested way about this question. There's a clear motivation behind it, which is to explain disparities on the ground today, which ends up skewing the scholarship to attribute more causal power to racist policies than probably they deserve.
Okay. You don't dispute that someone like Ira Katznelson's arguments about the New Deal may have merit, that there was bias and that it had consequences. You just don't think it's as important as those who are propounding the arguments about racial wealth gap think. And you don't think we could put a percentage on it. We don't need to do that. But if you say at the outside that they are saying 90%, you're saying something more like 20 or 30%, something like that. And moreover, if I don't want to put words in your mouth, you're saying.
So I like his approach to this, because by arguing this way, I'm talking about Coleman, by arguing this way, he can't just be shot down for not being willing to acknowledge
and by this way, by this way, you mean by naming other factors, talking about weights of different. Is that what you mean by arguing this way?
Well, yeah. Well, no, I'm saying the way that he's arguing is it's not necessary for him to disagree in totally with the progressive argument. He doesn't have to say that slavery had no impact. He just is saying it didn't have as much impact as you're saying. And that's a clever position to take, because it simultaneously allows you to acknowledge that slavery had an impact and other aspects that he's making. He's using this tact he's used a few times here, right? But then he's also able to show them that it's still hogwash, that you're using it as an excuse. I really think it's very clever. He's found this sort of middle ground to sit on that allows him to take advantage of both aspects of the scholarship, pertaining to this, both left leaning and right leaning. So I think that's very clever.
It's you call it clever because you're looking at it from a political lens, and I get it, but it's also just true, right? And this is true of most things, right? Yeah. In the sense that most things are always yes and, right?
Right.
It's never some kind of, no, that never existed. It's like, yes and blah, blah, blah. Like, that's how most things are. And a lot of times, I don't know, I'm going to throw a crazy number. Now people like to throw numbers out there. 85% of arguments, okay, are probably mostly likely about this schism, where rather than people just doing the yes and thing, which is always freaking true, right? They get all closed up, walled in, bring in the guards, that the ego gets, you can listen to all kinds of panels all day and watch happen right before your eyes. But let's continue.
You don't think we can put a percentage on it. We don't need to do that. But if you say at the outside that they are saying 90%, you're saying something more like 20 or 30%, something like that. And moreover, if I don't want to put words in your mouth, you're saying to focus the contemporary discussion on that 20 or 30%, if that's the right number, is not going to be particularly helpful at getting a solution to the problem.
Yes, that's true as well. But so, for example, I mentioned the Japanese and the Jews as minorities that were just discriminated against, but nevertheless did better than the majority. You can also think of minorities that did not experience any of those racist New Deal policies, but came here voluntarily, like Puerto Ricans to New York in the late 1950s. My grandparents were part of that wave. Had virtually all of the same quote unquote social pathologies exhibited by Black New Yorkers in terms of out of wedlock births and crime. And obviously that wasn't caused by them being excluded by some racist policy 20 years ago. So there's a huge correlation without causation, a potential correlation without causation problem that infects this entire way of thinking about explaining modern disparities. And, so that's what I'm getting at. Okay, well, it sounds to me like it's time to talk about culture, because it seems to me that the flip side of your argument, as you say, there were two kind of prongs here. So on the one hand, what's the source of the inequality? Well, what it's not slavery, and it's not the New Deal or whatever. It's not redlining. So then what is it? And looks like you got an answer to that question too. And the answer is culture. Am I reading you wrong or what? No, you're not reading me wrong.
So say something about that.
So there's such a thing as culture. It's by definition harder to study because you can't put culture in a beaker. You can't measure it. Many of the qualities that we refer to as culture are immeasurable. We're talking about attitudes towards education, what kinds of ideas you're exposed to growing up, the types of cultural scripts that you fall into, the kind of social status games that you are taught to play, the rubric you're given for what it means to live a good life and to live a life as an authentic such and such, whatever you happen to be. These are very, very difficult issues, and there is a bias not to study them, to the point where Orlando Patterson, Harvard sociologist who's done a lot of work on culture, jokingly calls it the C word to indicate that sociologists treat it as if it's a taboo or off limits. So, when it comes to Black culture, there are some ways, I think, to measure it. So if you I cite this Nielsen data in my piece, which is Nielsen, that they're just counting, they're tracking consumer behavior. It's for market research. They're counting the degree to which people in different ethnic groups buy luxury cars, buy fancy jewelry. And they find that Black people on average buy more in both of those.
And Eastern European women, ladies and gentlemen, yes, buying a lot of that. I'm surprised he went to that particular stat, to that one as a pointer. What do you think about that one? I don't know. Okay, Black culture. I'm going to point to this thing as an attribute of it and probably directly related to money. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was again in this conversation I had with my wife earlier. I was talking to her about, there's a certain dysfunction in the Black community, and I said the thing that I've said on our show before: the $1.7 trillion, Black folks spend. Black community spends, and the dollar lasts 6 hours in our community. Every dollar spent lasts 6 hours. And a lot of it is because we're rimming up a jalopy, it's totally ridiculous, totally ridiculous stuff. I was watching and this is a lot of years ago. This is probably, I don't know, probably 15 years ago. I was watching, I try not to watch BET, especially in that time period. It was really bad, but there was a video, and I think it was the sipping on some scissor video.
Sipping on some scissor, sipping on some sip.
Yes. Okay, you're hip. And in that video, these cats, this is some ridiculous stuff, man. So they're riding a lawnmower, cutting the trash on a rimmed up tractor. Okay, this is the kind of straight foolishness and straight money wasted stuff that I'm sorry to say is not an outlier in our community. This stuff is right in the middle. You will talk about the median, that's where it is. That money wasting stuff, wasting money on stuff, getting stuff that, like, dude, you can't even pay your bills. Why are you driving that kind of vehicle? Or you're living in like Section 8 housing, but you have a BMW. That stuff, that is not outlier. That's not the exception in our community. That is the rule.
And this cuts across also, you would say, economic. Now, granted, typically people are getting more money. Maybe it's because they're better with money and maybe they don't do that thing or is that crazy. But as a cultural thing, right? Because it has to cut across. Is this like a Black culture thing? Like whether or not
I think it is. I think
I agree too. Like, nice stuff is kind of
yeah, I think it is. And I don't know. It also seems as though sound decision making is, I mean, like, you can lose your cool card. You lose your Black card for being too common sense oriented. If you're too organized, you're too structured, you're too about business, that's not cool. It's not fresh.
Yeah, that's John McWhorter's favorite, the whole talking white aspect.
Yeah.
That's another pointer of the shall we say okay, but then let's play a little bit more of this. I know the time is spent. Play a little bit more, probably will continue also next week, right? But he has mentioned one cultural artifact or one aspect of culture. Should we point to the negative or let's see.
Categories. Not conditional on wealth or income, just period. Which is, I mean, you could say it's shocking, but on the other hand, when Dave Chappelle writes jokes about it, or Chris Rock writes jokes about how Black guys love like rims with the rims in their cars, somehow everyone in the room is laughing. So there's clearly a recognition, even on the part of Black people, that this is so. When I live in Harlem, just last night I was walking down to get some get something from the deli, and there's like a group of 20 Black kids, probably my age. All of them have jewelry and they're dressed in expensive clothes, and I would bet my life that they're not wealthy enough to justify necessarily having those clothes. And it's not a comment on it's not necessarily a comment on their intrinsic worth as people. They seem like perfectly good people. They were perfectly perfectly harmless. But why would we assume that it's the case that groups with entirely different histories, entirely different cultural values would nevertheless behave exactly the same? And there's so for example, in politics, we know that Black people vote at a much higher level than Asians and Hispanics, like by 10 or 20 percentage points. Clearly, that's not a wealth thing. It's not like Black people have more money and therefore more time to go vote. It's just Black people have at this moment in America, a much more political culture, probably having to do with the legacy of the civil rights movement or whatnot. We can admit that and say, well, yeah, that's not structural, that's just cultural. But why would politics be the only?
So I'm gonna put something on the table, and then let's kind of wrap up and wrap it up, right? And he just named some things which I would say, are behavioral, right? Well, behaviorism, or shall we say pointing out the behavior when it comes to social things, is a good thing to do, right? After all, it's the thing that we can observe when it comes to human affairs, right? So he said, hey, if you look over there at that Black region, okay, the Black people, you'll see money spending, behavior. You'll see, what else did he mention? He mentioned one more, right? Or was it all just the end with the money? He talked about, hold on one second.
Only region where that's true. That, and so probably having to do with the legacy of the civil rights movement or whatnot. We can admit that and say, well, yeah, that's not structural, that's just cultural. But why would politics be the only region where that's true?
Okay, but regardless, he's pointing to outward behaviors that you would see people doing this stuff But still, some could argue, well, no, not really. I'm trying to, trying to pull a Glenn Lowry here, or Steelman the thing, because some of the behaviors he's saying is directly detrimental to actually getting wealth, such as the overspending. That one is for real, true. I wonder what else you could say, right, about the Black culture that would be negative in that way, right?
Well, the probably the thing that's most devastating to our culture is just family structure. It's just the broken family structure, because it's directly at odds with wealth creation. Because one of the practical reasons to get married is now you don't have to have two houses. Right? So you have one house, everybody lives in the same house. And then the longer you can stay married, you get that first house paid off, and I don't know, maybe you keep it and you buy another house, but you have to stay married long enough to be able to facilitate any of that kind of basic stuff. So the high divorce rate in our community.
You got to stay married to be in the real estate business. I'm sorry, it's kind of
right.
You buy the house, they stay married along, you get the other house. You got to stay married, make these home purchases.
So, but there's two things with that. It's not just staying married; it's getting married early. See, in general, people are waiting later and later to get married, but in our community, folks are waiting a long time, and particularly women are waiting later and later to get married. And I think part of that is because Black women appear to not be aging. Of course they are, just like everybody else is, but they appear not to be aging like other women are. And so I think sometimes because of that, they think that they have more time, and when you wait until later to get married, it might seem like it's the positive thing, because now you know yourself better and you know what you like and all like this. Well, that can be a plus and a minus. It's probably a minus because as you get older, you also become less malleable. You become more, sort of entrenched in whatever it is, and then your expectations are higher. So then it's harder for you to find somebody that meets all of your expectations, right? Plus you wasted a bunch of years spending money that you could have been saving by actually been, already been married when you were younger. So that's a big issue. The divorce rate in our community is sky high. Women are 80% of the divorces are being filed by women.
You stepped outside of the behavior thing. In other words, you're pointing to these numbers. So what is Black culture? Is Black culture divorce? That's something that.
I would say it. I would say that is symptomatic of the bigger issue, which is poor mate selection. And poor mate selection is clearly a behavior. If I'm prioritizing swag over substance, if I'm not, dating the kind of people that would actually be conducive to possibility of even getting married.
Us back to that swag over substance. The guys with the chains, the guys spending the money on the rims with the. So it seems, because we weren't trying to go back there, but it seems like even when we went to the family thing, which is definitely a big thing when you look at the numbers and all that kind of stuff, and we try to bring it back to the behavior, we get the swag over substance. So that's swag over substance culture.
There's no good. There's not as many, I think, positive examples in our community of regular people, and so because of that, the tendency is going to be to follow what you see, and if what you see is disproportionately negative, then that's what you're going to emulate. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's pretty clear.
a better excuse than the find yourself excuse, because I don't like the modern the find yourself excuse, the whole the excuse of I didn't know any better, I can still tolerate. Well, because that's just the majority of people. There's some people who cannot make that excuse though, and they know themselves. They're the ones wrestling with their conscience at night, knowing that they knew. Like,
Right.
But I mean, well, I don't want you see. I was about to jump into the conversation right again, but Dr. Thunder, what's going on Thursday?
Yeah. So I am. Let's see here. I have. Let me just do it this way. This will make it easier. Yeah, I got this show here.
What's that?
If you can get rid of the technological chaos's comment.
Jesse Lee Peterson.
Yeah, can you move? Yeah, there it is. Yeah, so this is there is a context for protection, and we were talking about this actually. It's called marriage. That's the context for protection. And over here on the left, you can see that there is. Actually, can you see this when I do that? No, you can't. Over on the left, you can see that the women divorce rate by race, and at the top, the very top one is black women. Right, the very top percentage is black women. That has a big impact on what's happening. And it seems to me that complaining about not being protected, but then also being the most divorced, but being the most divorced while you're the one filing 80% of the divorces, that doesn't seem to square. And this is not an attempt to blame black women for everything. It's not that at all. But I think that there's a level of dysfunction in our community that most of which is self-imposed at this point. And we need to start looking at what this is. But Jesse always talks about the vertical. He always talks about the vertical order: God over man, man over women, women over children. And that's why I have that umbrella: God, and then God over husband, husband over wife, right? And so that's a thing. But Kevin also said a similar thing, which seemed like it was borrowed from Jesse. And this was this whole the man belongs to God, the woman belongs to the man, and the children belong to the woman, this kind of thing. And everyone reports up or whatever. He was saying it that kind of way. But it's all the same thing. It's the biblical order. If everyone submits to that order, everyone's protected. Those that don't submit to the order are not protected. It's very simple. If you're not submitted to the order, you're not protected. And it's possible that some folks don't recognize that is the divine order, and that's fine. But I think most people know that it's the divine order, and they choose not to submit to the divine order. Those folks, it doesn't make sense to me to complain about not being protected if you're not aligned in the in the order that would protect you. So what you're saying obviously is important. It's going to be that sounds like an interesting show there, right? What you're saying there is important, but with regards to the people whom are complaining, they're not worth complaining about, because if they already know what they're doing, then it's all just a waste of time, right? Right.
So
it's all cap. It's all just basically trying not to take responsibility for their own behavior, their own actions.
Plus, I don't even think it's real. Like, I think that that this is a side conversation, but generally speaking, okay, there's a certain type of women, girls, adult female humans, and young ones.
Shout out, what is a woman?
Katanji Jackson, or But there's an attention thing, right? That's attention motive behind a lot of what they do. And this is not from a point of judgment to impugn it. It's just kind of saying that a lot of the things that they do or that they say, and this time, let's say in social media, just is what it is. It's not even really, it's just, you know what I mean? It's got you talking, it's got you saying something. It's just like saying, oh, it's like complaining about the seat in the Uber that you just took for a 5-minute drive. And then you just get on social media and go, oh my God, and blah, 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 and then you forget about it. I think a lot of that is what's going on. It is you're just doing their attention thing, and then you might mistake it that they're even. So, well, I think that a couple of things. You mentioned Not in This World by Gynocracy and Swag Over Substance, right? And as you talk about it, I want to talk about the men, because we're talking about getting things done and we're talking about productivity, generally speaking, talking to men. And men that come up in a situation like this where there is gynocracy and swag over substance, right? And I think that there's a lot to be drilled into there and spoken about, rather than, let's completely go indoors now, let's say. Rather than come out again and talk systemically about who's causing it, who's doing it, how it can be remedied, blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, cool. Can you recognize that what it is to be in a situation where your cultural milieu respects swag over substance? How does it manifest itself? How are you being blinded by that? How is that leading you? What does it, what it would look like if it were not? How would it change your behavior, let's say, and therefore lead to better outcomes, perhaps, right? So, just as you were saying, not blaming women and all that kind of stuff. A, not blaming women. B, it's a pointless thing. But it's interesting, since we've highlighted this swag over substance, seeing that it is rather central. And then there's a gynocracy aspect to it too, which perhaps is outside of a natural order aspect to it too. And then if you concretize that, if you say, okay, cool, that's what that's what we're calling the quote unquote black culture. And here is why that is not amenable to wealth, generational wealth, or productive men, let's say. The swag over substance part is definitely a great hindrance to being productive as a man, right? Because anyways, but so ladies and gentlemen, look out for that show Thursday. Okay, there is a context to protection. But ladies and gentlemen, this has been another great episode of Getting Itch Done. We talked about culture and its relation to getting the bag, to getting things done. They're cultural blocks, and we got Glenn Lowry, Dr. Thunder, Coleman Hughes laying it all down about the slavery and the Jim Crow and the redlining. But what about the culture? And finally, we got to the culture, and we talked about it too. And we'll continue next week. Shout out to Kwafi Nino in the house, Technological Chaos, for the very, very generous total of $60 that he put in, and other super chatters, and Daria, and yes, ladies and gentlemen. Until next time, peace.
In the den of iniquity, vicinity no pretty, calamity fi hit we any moment, what a pity. Tomorrow never certain, what was behind the curtain, the face of evil lurking, with the shifty eyes averting. It's not a steady bubble, that either pop or topple, many will fall and stumble, let the dozers gather rubble. From LA to Colorado, Guinea to Burkina Faso, cannons could reach the towers and the troops will storm the castle. I say, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. So run, come, make me get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. I say, run, come, make me get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. Lord, run, come, make me get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. With the rubble steady right rising, and hearts are compromising. Convictions here are stifling, making evil appetizing. The fists are steady forming, and countenance is falling. Defenses are withdrawing, possibilities are falling. In these circumstances, evil will make advances. Pick up your sword and lances, and be sure to take your stances. Victory is never promised. The battle is upon us. Gather the brave and honest, and the righteous in your corners.
I don't remember right now.